Hello YouTube. Today's video is going to be a little different, but in the line of Kubernetes. And today's video is going to be focused around single cluster, but I'll move this to multi-cluster next week. So today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the nginx gateway fabric. And so this is ultimately nginx implementation of gateway API. And as you are aware, and if you're not aware, the gateway API is the new method of being able to ingress traffic into your cluster. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the nginx gateway fabric, and I'm actually going to provide a demo of using the nginx gateway fabric with F5 Big IP. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll go into kind of the details and kind of the setup that I did, and kind of like this is not necessarily an alternative, but kind of like the better together of kind of what F5 Big IP is bringing and how it can enhance the nginx gateway fabric and the gateway API use case. And really the ultimate is future-proofing or future-proof Kubernetes applications connectivity, right? So make sure that you increase uptime. And I think also, to be honest with you, reduce complexity, because this demo is actually not really that complicated. It's actually pretty simple. So reducing the complexity of your Kubernetes apps with this gateway API conformant nginx gateway fabric. And so that's really what I want to talk about. So let's go and take a look at my environment here. And so we'll take a look at this diagram, and then we'll go and provide the demo. So what you can actually see here is a single Kubernetes cluster. And the next video, I'm actually going to introduce multi-cluster. So we're going to have multiple Kubernetes clusters, and I'm going to send traffic across the clusters. But this is going to focus today on a single cluster, and within that cluster, we have the nginx gateway fabric deployed, pod deployed. And as you can see, it has both control plane and of course the data plane. And then of course behind the gateway is the applications and how the applications are deployed. And these applications are deployed using HTTP routes. And so that's a little bit new for the folks that are not familiar with the construct or the gateway API constructs, but I'll kind of give you a little bit of a demo there, kind of like how that works. We got some ingress traffic here, or Big IP will get the traffic from outside the cluster into the cluster. So there's an IP address. You could call it type load balancer or of load balancer type to get the traffic to the service or get the traffic to the endpoint. In this case, the endpoint is of the nginx gateway fabric. So in this case right here, a.example.com, b.example.com, or / it could be, for example, cafe with different paths are coming into the gateway fabric, and then the gateway fabric, based on the routes, is routing it to the appropriate pod based on the configuration of the HTTP route. And so that's ultimately the concept, but the route spec provides way more flexibility than traditional ingress or ingress class. And that's one of the reasons why this is somewhat new and why this community is driving the concept of gateway API. And so, like I said, reduce complexity. Now, you might think by bringing in Big IP, you're actually introducing more complexity, and really you're not. You've got to get traffic into the cluster. So if you don't use an F5 Big IP, you have to use something else. Well, the one thing that is actually kind of cool here is that F5 can actually be automated from inside the Kubernetes cluster using a controller called Container Ingress Services, or CIS. And CIS actually monitors the kube API. What's really nice about this is that you don't need to create a service of type load balancer as well as using node port. You can actually use cluster IP. And there's many benefits of using cluster IP. So from the data plane perspective, it's big IP directly to the nginx gateway fabric pod. So big IP has visibility directly to the pod itself, bypassing any type of kube proxy, any type of proxy itself. It basically is using the integrated container network. And in this case that is of Calico. So that is how big IP routes traffic to the nginx gateway fabric is by an advertised BGP route from inside the cluster out to big IP of the pod subnet. So big IP will actually know all of your gateway fabrics pods that are deployed, and actually you can actually replicate this up. And so let's go and take a look at what that actually looks like. So you can actually see what I've done is I've actually exposed a service, and I will talk a little bit about that and the configuration in a minute. And so this is one of the things that you have to do, is that you have to expose the nginx gateway fabric to whatever you're using to get traffic into the cluster. And so I've done that using a service which I created, and that is the nginx gateway fabric, and it's just called service.yaml. But what you will notice here is that in this case here we're using edge, which you can change, but in this case here I've changed this from node port to cluster IP, and here I am actually creating an endpoint and servicing both port 80 and port 443. And so what will happen is CIS will monitor the service. And so CIS will be able to identify the endpoints and be able to configure or plumb the big IP based on this configuration. And it will monitor these endpoints. And you could, if these endpoints are not available, then that pod will actually be removed and traffic won't be sent to it. And so that's the big change here compared to the standard installation. So let's go and take a look at the standard installation. The documentation is actually very good. If you go to the docs, and you could actually just kind of follow along here. You could actually see your prerequisites, and then you can actually use Helm or Manifest. In my case, I used a Manifest. So the first thing I did was make sure that I have the SIG, the Community SIG Gateway API CRDs and the schema loaded. The second thing I did was I didn't need to do this because my Kubernetes version is 127, 128. And then I created the CRDs. I created the nginx gateway deployments. And the only thing that I needed to change there on the nginx piece was the amount of replicas that I would like to have. And so I actually changed it from 1 to 2 replicas, as you can see right here. So in the cluster, I'm going to have 2 nginx gateway fabrics. That's basically 2 pods, and CIS will detect the 2 pods. Now, if I actually increase this replicas, then what will happen is CIS will detect it and configure or automate the big IP right away. What I also did was, like I said, I created the service, and this is of service cluster IP. So that is big IP directly to the nginx fabric without using the combination of, for example, node port. And so I changed it a little bit. I changed a little bit up there where the docs say kind of like, I think right here. So there is you could actually see it right here. If I actually go into Kubernetes and actually run this command, you can actually see there are my 2 pods. So there's pod 1, pod 2 running. And then if I go and scroll down, you can see now this is the whole concept of exposing the nginx gateway fabric. You don't have to expose it. You can just, like I said, create the service. CIS will plumb big IP. So there's no need to create this node port service, you just create the service of cluster IP. So this is a little different. Similar configuration, the only thing I changed was the type. And in this case, I didn't use the load balance service, but you can, if you want to on CIS, you can use a service of type load balancer. What I did instead was create a CRD for CIS to monitor to plumb big IP. So let's go and take a look at that CRD that is on CIS. And so CIS has a simple schema, and this is a kind virtual server. And so CIS is only watching the nginx gateway namespace. It's only watching the nginx gateway fabric, nothing else. And in this case here, it is for this host name, and here is the virtual IP that gets configured on the big IP. And so if we go look at the big IP right there, you can actually see it 10.192.75.121, and that is the simple CRD. You can see I'm servicing port 80. You can create another virtual server or use a transport server for port 443. If you want to use simple L4, you can do that with just 2 transport servers for whatever ports you're doing. What's also really nice here, since big IP is there, if you have Postgres or if you have any TCP-based application that you don't want to send through the nginx gateway, big IP can do direct to pod. So you can send all HTTP, HTTPS traffic through the gateway fabric, and then you can go from big IP direct to pod if it's any TCP type traffic that is of non-HTTP or non-HTTPS. So that kind of gives you that flexibility there if there's a database traffic or some legacy application that is listening on something else. So it provides that flexibility for you in a pretty simple way of configuring it. So once you create this CRD, what will happen is it will create the virtual. And then on big IP, what will then happen is that it will create the pool members. And you can actually see right here that in my pool members, I have two pods. And these are the two pods that I have. And this is 10.244.235. So you can actually see that is on the pod subnet. That is actually the cluster IPs of those 2 pods. And so big IP is sending traffic directly. And we can actually connect to this virtual. You can actually see right here, you can see the requests are hitting this virtual. So this is T, and I can connect to coffee as well. And this is just 2 applications that are exposed, the actual endpoint traffic. And so you can actually see, if we take a look at what that is to configure, if we actually go into the application itself, we can actually see this is just a simple namespace. Let's go, and this is the simple cafe app that you can see right here. There's coffee app. That's the application that I'm hitting that's living on port 8080. And that's all being routed. That is all being routed by the fabric to the pod itself. Big IP just sees this as layer 4, maybe layer 5 traffic. It's just really just layer 4 traffic at this point. That is just passing everything through. It's just basically saying, I'm network fabric, gateway fabric, I'm giving you the traffic. And you could see that based on the diagram. If you go back to the diagram, what's happening is big IP basically says any traffic for cafe.example.com, send it to one of the 2 nginx gateways. And then big IP will use its load balancing algorithms, its persistence methods. You can turn that all off if you wanted to. You could terminate SSL. You could put WAF bot DOS out the front here. It really depends on what you want to do. But from a site perspective, securing the cluster. And then, of course, the next video, we're going to talk about scaling across 2 clusters, not just a single cluster. So let's go back and talk a little bit about the other one item, which was the routes. And so as you can see right here, there is the path of coffee, and that's what the app is listening on. And so that is the host name. And so you can actually see this whole new construct of gateway networking v1 with the kind of HTTP route and the name. and the name gateway, and you can kind of see this is kind of new to a lot of people, and it's almost CRD like, which I really like, because it allows for this custom spec, and so it's quite easy to actually, as a vendor, be able to kind of create your own custom spec here, instead of having to create annotations. And then you could have this on one namespace and have it on a completely different namespace, and that is what's very key. Actually, in fact, all of this actually right here is on a different namespace. This is all on the cafe namespace. You could actually see I actually created it right here. I actually created this namespace called cafe. And so that's actually really cool. You can actually have the gateway on one namespace and apps on a different namespace. What you could also do is CIS only lives in one namespace, and that's the only thing that's watching is the nginx fabric. And so it kind of creates that separation, delineation of kind of like network operator, network Kubernetes admin to DevOps kind of operator, creation, manipulation of applications between the fabric, the gateway API fabric, and the actual pods itself. And then the last thing I think we should take a look at here is the gateway construct, the actual command itself. And so this actually right here is the kind gateway, and this is a gateway class nginx, and then of course here's the listener. So we come in on port 80, we go out on port 8080, and this is for everything for this host name of cafe.example.com. And so I think the next big question is that what can Big IP do to kind of somewhat maybe watch this gateway. Maybe this gateway is also what the fabric is listening on, but also potentially what Big IP can listen on too, because maybe we only create one gateway command, and that Big IP can actually listen to that within the kube cluster. So I think that's kind of like the next steps, to do more integration here. But as of now, CIS still requires the CRD to get traffic to the cluster. So we covered quite a lot in the quick demo, but what I would like to do is just go ahead and just review the architecture again, review the diagram. And so what we're talking about here is the capability of being able to use nginx gateway fabric. It's the implementation of gateway API that is running within the cluster. We have two implementations, two pods of the gateway fabric. Those two pods are being load balanced by Big IP. Big IP has a public IP. The public IP is exposed to the network, and that public IP resolves to like potentially maybe AB, or it resolves to just *example.com in this case, cafe.example.com. And Big IP will take that and then route that traffic to one of the gateway fabrics. If that gateway fabric goes down, then Big IP will make sure that that traffic is routed to an appropriate gateway fabric that is available. So we can enable keep alives of the gateway fabric itself. And I will provide that maybe in a later demo of how to kind of create those keep alives, or there's documentation on how to do that. And so what CIS does is CIS is watching the kube API specifically for the nginx gateway fabric, and it's watching the service because it's service type cluster IP. And so that means that CIS is monitoring the endpoints of this. And then there's a CRD that is created that will basically, CIS, what it will do is it will use its AS3 based API or automation to plumb the Big IP. And so what you get is a virtual server that front ends the Kubernetes cluster. And you can see the very, very, very simple configuration here within Big IP. This is just a very simple construct, basically saying for cafe.example.com, go to the pools, and the pools in this case have two pools, and it's two gateway fabrics. That's really it. And then you can see the connection to the traffic, cafe.example.com/coffee or /t. That's it, folks. That's the demo. So this again is of course, single cluster. The next demo will be multi-cluster. And there'll be Nginx gateway fabrics deployed in 2 different clusters. I'll demo that next week. Have a lovely Thanksgiving. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps the YouTube algorithm. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. I'm chasing 1,000 subscribers, and I really appreciate everyone that's subscribed. And if you have any comments, please let me know. If you would like me to create anything else from a demo perspective, also please let me know. Thank you very much.